Thank you very much. Thank you, Asad and Kunal. I think both the workshop and the exhibition need to be seen as a form of continuum. And I'm sure your enjoyment will be more if you look at it that way. One other point based on what Kunal has just shown is, the entire show is based on the different type of multimedia approaches, the different type of products and objects related with Art Deco. But it occurs to me that if you look for similarities and if you look for overlaps, you will probably have a richer experience because they form a kind of, a confluence, a kind of triangulation of different ideas, which although they come from very different kind of sources, they all tend to interflow and react with each other. And you get a richer and richer sense of this time, which I hope you will get by the end of the day. I am going to talk to you about the rise of Art Deco in Bombay very specifically, so that we can have a more grounded kind of picture of the architecture of the city during the 1930s and 1940s. And I'll kind of get into it directly because I have several slides and a bit to read. There are different trajectories for the beginning of Art Deco in different places in the world. But here in Bombay, I think we need to look at it from the point of view of a pandemic, I suppose would be the best way to put it. In the late 1890s, when there was a plague in the city, which led to a lot of its denizens dying and a lot going out of the city. And the entire kind of thing was laid on the fact of, the congestion, the lack of hygiene, people living too close to each other, and so on. And because of that, the powers that be sought to create different types of spaces that were more organized, more spread out, more planned. And it is this idea of micro-planning in a largely unplanned city that starts off the whole discourse that leads to, inadvertently I would say, Art Deco coming to a center stage. This problem of pandemic would be repeated once again in 1918 when you had the Spanish flu. Perhaps more people died of the Spanish flu than of the plague. But once again, the whole discussion of, needing a more, a cleaner city, a more hygienic city became directly related with the physical form of things in the city. And that is where we begin. So I begin with this reimagination of Bombay in 1911. It is a very important and very famous kind of plan. It is called the Davidge Plan. So Bombay's architecture underwent a significant shift by the beginning of the 1930s. Several locations in the city were actively planned as precincts and neighborhoods. The southern tip of the peninsula was the site of vast and city-defining reclamations. This is one of the first important ideas of Art Deco in Bombay, is that the shape of the city itself was prone to change because of these very ambitious reclamations that were happening. This plan, the ambitious W.R. Davidge plan, had intended to redefine the southern end of Bombay in a very classical layout of monuments, boulevards, circuses, and plazas. It didn't happen this way, but what did happen were what we now know as the Back Bay reclamations, which happened in two phases. And they are a kind of truncated version of this plan. So the first phase of the Back Bay reclamation led to the buildings around the Oval Maidan, now the ones which are the most loved Art Deco buildings and the most loved Art Deco precinct. The areas west of the Esplanade were reclaimed by 1930, enclosing the Oval Maidan on the west and allowing for a fresh set of plots laid grid-wise, reclaimed out of the sea. The grid plan of these new kind of planning interventions was, I think, one of the shape of the plots themselves led to the creation of a different kind of architecture that was no longer touching each other, no longer congested, but much more laid out with a lot of breathing space in the middle. The other reclamation which took place led to the creation of the Queen's Necklace. This was in place by 1940. In both cases, the revised intent of the Bombay government was less the hope of creating new urbanity, but more the hope, as it is today, sadly, of maximizing revenues from the sales of plots to be used both for commercial and residential purposes. But the reclamations weren't the only place where these interventions happened. Even north of what we now call the mill lands, you had the developments of these new precincts, most significantly the Dadar Matunga estate. And this is a Google Earth image of the Dadar Matunga estate, and you can see planning right there with that central circle. So such plotted developments, which were created by different avatars of the Bombay Improvement Trust, were carried out all over the city, not only the Back Bay, as I said, but even on the mainland neighborhoods like Princess Dock, Elphinstone Road, Kolaba, Muhammad Ali Road, Baikala, Nagpada, Princess Street, Sandhurst Road, and north of the Millland, Sion, Parel, Dadar Matunga along the King's Way, what we now call the King's Circle, and also commercial districts in the south like the Firoz Shah Mehta Road, which was carved out to connect Ballard Estate with the Esplanade. Now, here is where we get into our subject. There was a Catholicism in the developments that cut across the former boundaries of the colonial city and native town. They brought these, in a sense, together. The former segregations of the colonizers and the subject population, had stressed more on the creation of public buildings, monumental buildings. But over a period of time, you have mercantilism, trade, banking, insurance, which comes into a big way in the city, and that changes this port city from being merely a port city into a kind of financial hub. So after the plague, as I mentioned, of 1896, there was this need to set up urban layouts that were, to quote Claude Batley, a very important architect and teacher of Bombay at that time, layouts that were healthy making, that were needed to contribute to the wealth making of the city. So these layouts, which you see, as we can see in this image, were laid out in what was called the garden city kind of layout, where you had wide roads, a lot of parks, greeneries, but all the buildings were laid out on plotted developments with probably very rectangular kind of shape of plots. So in this way, the attempt was to create both a healthier and hygienic city. The new architecture of the city, which came up on these very plotted developments, now tells us about the change that happens. In this case, the new workplaces. What you are seeing here are the buildings along the Firoz Shah Mehta Road. To the right, you have the Lakshmi Insurance Building. To the left, the Citibank Building, both built by the architecture firm of Master Sathe and Bhuta. Here is another important point, that by the end of the 1920s, the colonial project of the British, as far as architecture and building monumental buildings was concerned, was more or less done. At least in Bombay, you don't really find major British imperial buildings, say, after the Gateway of India. That is the last kind of big one. Attention kind of turned to Delhi, the development of Lutyens Delhi. And Bombay, in that vacuum, started getting a completely new architecture, this time not built by the British, but by the architects of Bombay itself. And these buildings which you see are the ones which emerge from that. So when we talk of Art Deco in Bombay, we also have to talk about Bombay's architects who built Art Deco in Bombay. So these buildings which came up now were for more contemporary needs and not just for monumental show. So you have buildings like office buildings which we see over here, or you have domestic architecture which you see in the examples of the Oval. This is the Rusi court on the Oval. Or you have cinema theatres, or you have other such typologies which are all for the people of the city themselves rather than showpieces for empire. So I'm just taking this example of Rusi court on the Oval. What perhaps was not envisaged by the British was the fact that the new architecture that would emerge would be so substantially different from what was imperial architecture, because the last two great imperial projects in Bombay, one is the Gateway of India, the other is probably the Prince of Wales Museum. Both were what we can call Indo-Saracenic. Okay, both were mandated British styles for creating an architecture that looked Indian. But for the architects of Bombay, that was not a restriction at all. And they looked to a worldwide emergence of architecture at the same time, which was completely modern in outlook, contemporary in its technology and building, and quite different from what was seen as an earlier type of architecture. Even the domestic architecture of the earlier times, which is much more related to the tropics, you had stone facades, you had very deep roofs which were sloping, you had these wooden balconies and so on, was now completely transformed into a style where you are using a new material, which is RCC, to be able to create a new kind of architecture. Now, one of the driving forces for this new kind of architecture between the wars, as was already pointed out, was the fact that there was an emerging middle class. It was rising, and I think this image kind of shows that well. It is an illustration from the Journal of the Indian Institute of Architects in 1942, and it just presents to you an ideal city. And if you look in this ideal city, you find everything is built in RCC. You find things are laid out in plotted developments. You find flat roofs, which to me is the one significant, signifier of Art Deco architecture compared to what came earlier to it. And you find modern things like new cars, and look at the way people dress and so on. So the period between the two world wars was also the time for the consolidation of Bombay's middle class. In many families, the first generations of college-educated and English-speaking citizens were now asserting themselves in the white-collar workplace, finding jobs in offices, banks, and insurance companies, whose buildings we have already seen were being erected. This generation was one step away from their migrant parents and grandparents who had sought to make their work as workers in the different mills of the city and on the harbor. Now you had finance and mercantilism occupying center stage along with industry and trade. This potential middle class was also aspirational. Okay, they were looking at international developments and wanted to have those here. And at the same time, to help their aspirations, you had a new emergence of professional architects who were educated in Bombay, also setting up their practices, and we will discuss their influence a little later. Popular culture was pretty much a driving force at this time in the creation of this new type of architecture. Cinema obviously became the central hub for public entertainment, and you have so many cinema theaters that emerged during the 30s and 40s, all self-similar in some sort of Art Deco form. All these cinema theaters give us the impression of a very large amount of consumers of this, and that therefore there is the need. It also tells us about the public realm. And this is an important factor I would like to talk about in Bombay, because here you have a public space which is then occupied by everyone. There is no class divide in this kind of space. The public area is the space for everyone, and the cinema theater is one such public space. And the architecture itself also talks about this public space because it is right there on the road. If you notice, there are no barriers between this building and the road itself. The buildings are themselves on the road. And this is something pretty special about the architecture that emerges in Bombay. Of course, it already has a past. You do not find the equivalent, I don't think even today, you find the equivalent of what are known as Tony areas, which we know from other parts of the world. There are no real Tony areas in Bombay. The very rich live side by side with the very poor. That has always been the case. And I mean, it's the case with Antilla, for example. Right? So, talking about popular culture, media publications from India and abroad proliferated and were shared and discussed and internalized. The stars of Bombay cinema were seen against the backdrop of Art Deco architecture or Art Deco furniture. And the cinemas themselves became the big things. Here I show you two metro cinemas. Okay, one is a poster of the metro cinema opening in Bombay, and the other one is in Brisbane, in Australia, both of which were probably, promoted by Metro Goldwyn Mayer, the big Hollywood company. So you have the metro in Bombay and the metro in Brisbane. They come within a year of each other. Okay, and you can see the similarity in the marquee, and you can see the similarity in the kind of form. But let me give you another 4 metro cinemas. Okay, and these are in Calcutta, in Johannesburg, in Cairo, and in Durban. All metro cinemas, all having the same type of marquee, all having fairly self-similar architecture. And this is a sign of the internationalism of this type of architecture that was happening all over the world, especially in the port cities, all at the same time. Look at the years. Okay, this impression which we have of architecture, Bombay has the most buildings of Art Deco architecture, second only to Miami, I think is largely a myth. The numbers don't matter. Look at the proliferation. Okay, it doesn't matter whether we have more buildings. The point is everybody had Art Deco. And I'm sure in your experience too, even if you go to the smallest towns of India, you will find Art Deco buildings over there. It's not only the Maharaja's palaces that were Art Deco, which of course they were, but you find Art Deco as the architecture of the common people. And that is a very important thing about the architecture of Art Deco in Bombay and in India and in these other port cities, as is shown by this simple example of 6 metro cinemas, all coming up at the same time. So the 30s and 40s were a very fecund time for domestic architecture in Bombay. You have, as has been mentioned, the Maharajas who were having city houses, in Bombay, which were in apartment buildings like these on the Marine Drive, or a building like Dhanraj Mahal, which were all part of that whole continuum of having a lavish lifestyle, both in the princely states as well as its equivalent in a largely dense and urbanized city. So let's look at some of these buildings. This is Sunshine, a building on the Oval Maidan by the architect G.B. Matre. These are different now, once again, because what we see here is an apartment building. An apartment building is a slightly different thing in nature from what was there earlier, where you had a large amount of community housing. An apartment building is different. Why? Because it is an inherently cosmopolitan space designed for nuclear families who would probably have to live side by side with people who are not like themselves. Okay, they were living side by side with people of different caste, religion, eating habits, education, unlike their own, and had to do so in a spirit of accommodation and cordiality. And our whole thing, which we now take for granted, we all probably live in apartment buildings. You have these buildings where you have this kind of behavior, these kind of adjustments and negotiations, which are being developed. The architecture too reflects this kind of development, because no longer now do you have inner spaces, like courtyards and things like that, but it's all outward facing kind of architecture. You don't have deep eaved roofs. You have multi-storied buildings with these kind of shooting cantilevers which emerge, and they come out onto the road itself. The most interesting thing I find about Art Deco architecture in Bombay is it is very typically meant to be viewed. Okay, and when you want to view Art Deco, you have to be on the street. So it doesn't matter if you don't live in an Art Deco building. The point is you are surrounded by them. Okay, you live in an Art Deco ecosystem in any case. And I think that was a very interesting and a very optimistic time for the rising middle class. Not only that, but for the public at large, living in this public realm called Bombay, surrounded everywhere by buildings that were offering themselves for view. Okay, and that is, I think, a fairly special thing. Let's talk a little bit about Bombay's architects. By the 30s, several architectural practices had already been established. Amongst these were the first generations of Indian architects who had for most part graduated from the Sir J.J. School of Art, which was the only school at that time. The school had a separate department of architecture, which was handled over time by some of Bombay's leading architects, like Robert Cable, Claude Batley, C.M. Master. Amongst the influential teachers were such architects as G.B. Matre, D.W. Ditchburn, P.P. Kapadia, S.H. Parelkar, and Homi Dallas. They, along with their students and their proteges, were the homegrown architects who determined the course of Bombay's architecture over the next several decades. So the very interesting thing at that time, which has not been repeated since, was that the biggest architects in the city were also running the School of Architecture. Two firms have to be mentioned here. One is the firm of Gregson, Batley and King, which was probably one of Bombay's biggest architecture firms. Now, I refer to Gregson, Batley and King as Bombay architects and not British architects, because ultimately most of them made Bombay their home. And amongst them, Claude Batley, who was the principal architect, headed the school for 20 years, from 1923 to 43, and had an immense influence. Okay, he lived on Marine Drive, he died here, he is buried in the Sivri Cemetery. So for 20 years he ran the show, and he was succeeded by C.M. Master. That is Batley at the extreme end, and C.M. Master is the one in the white shirt over here. This photograph is taken in front of the architecture school in the J.J. campus, and on the extreme left on this side is G.B. Matre. C.M. Master ran the other big firm, probably even bigger than Batley, because they did most of the insurance buildings and office buildings, called Master Sathe and Bhuta. After Batley, C.M. Master took over as the head of the school for another, I think, 8 years or so. So what you find here is that the people who are building all over India are also the people who are teaching. And their influence is immense, because the graduates who emerge just go directly into practice, and then they do a lot of the architecture that comes from that time onwards. Now, I'm not going into this because this has already been shown by Kunal, the architecture of the choice made by by these people of what kind of architecture should come up in the 30s and 40s is what we now call Art Deco. And this is a very important point. It was not called Art Deco in its time. Art Deco is a name which actually starts to come into prominence as far later as 1968, when Bevis Hillier writes his first kind of substantial book on this period, and he chooses, he picks out the name Art Deco from the exhibition which Kunal has shown us, the 1925 Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs. So the Art Deco comes out of that. During its time, it really didn't have a name. Okay, it was just the architecture that was happening at that time. As you correctly mentioned, the first important buildings we see are the architecture of the Maharajas, not in Bombay, but two important buildings are the Manik Bagh in Indore, which is designed by Eckhart Muthesius, and the Umaid Bhavan in Jodhpur, and that is the basement swimming pool of the Umaid Bhavan in Jodhpur. And you can see how very richly ornamented it is in the kind of Art Deco. So this is originally, Art Deco was very indexical with affluence, with the elite, with the rich, with fantastic materials, rare materials, and that's why we see it in the different forms like jewelry and so on. But once it starts to gain prominence in India, it becomes everyday. It becomes everyman. And I think that is another important thing that you can take away. In Bombay, the architecture of the time did not have a name beyond its occasional reference as modern. Claude Batley, in a lecture which he gives in the Indian Institute of Architects in 1934, merely calls this new architecture. That is what he calls it. And this is what he says. This new architecture in one sense, this new architecture is in one sense the nudist movement in our profession. Okay, he meant an architecture that was a return to primary essentials. You get away from all those extreme ornamentation and things like that and go back to the point. I think one of the things, when the question was being asked and you had to respond, is the fact that, why did people cut their hair short? And that is also indexical of the architecture at this time also, is that it's moving towards functionality and not merely decoration. It's moving towards functionality, towards efficiency. One of the reasons why the hair was cut short in the interwar periods is that women were working. Okay, and you could not have these very elaborate kind of presentations of hair on a day-to-day basis when women were working. And we do know that during the Second World War, the entire back office was run by women because all the men were on the front. Not only the back office, the industries were run by women. You have this amazing image of what is called Rosie the Riveter. Yeah? So the dresses kind of reflected the efficiencies of work, and so did the architecture. And this architecture, which Batley suggests, that you should have an architecture where beauty comes out of truth, which basically means that a beautiful building is simply the product of the way it is built, not of the way it is decorated. Okay, and that is why Art Deco looks like this. This very beautiful building, sadly, has also been been marred by the JJ flyover, which just starts at this point. Okay, and this is exactly opposite the college where I teach, just across from the JJ campus. But it is Himalaya House, and to me, a fabulous example of Art Deco architecture. Fortunately, the building is as it is. Yes, literally that. All people had developed it independently, because what we find is that this kind of architecture comes in a very self-similar way all over the world. Please also, I mean, it would help to know that a lot of the Bombay buildings predate the Florida buildings. Okay, so it is not that one leads to the other. Yes, absolutely. In one sense, I think the tropical conditions that we find ourselves in Bombay are very definitely taken care of by the Art Deco buildings which come up. Even the flat roofs. Because they are all now built in RCC, okay, which has an inherent way of resisting rain, but that's not the only thing. Okay, but I can come to that. Yeah. Now, one of the important things about Art Deco everywhere, and especially Art Deco in India, is the rise of new materials and technologies. This is important. The buildings of the 30s and 40s demonstrated the potential of a new material, and that was reinforced cement concrete. And it showcased the play that this material can allow when it comes to different forms of the buildings. And that is why you have these amazing cantilevers which come out, these balconies which soar, the corners which get curved. You know, you can have any kind of design, and it was accompanied by applied concrete in the form of external finishes like plaster or flooring, which becomes such an integral part of Art Deco interior spaces. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why Art Deco is seen everywhere, I think we can directly attribute to the cement companies. These cement companies came together to form an association called the Association of Cement Companies, ACC, who made it their kind of life's purpose to advertise. They just advertised and advertised and advertised in such a way that they completely won over both the architects as well as the clients, and at every scale. So as one of the things you can see over here is this first image is from an annual brochure they used to bring out called the Modern House in India. And I have a couple of copies of that. The only thing in that are photographs of buildings taken, built in that year. That is all. Okay, there's nothing else to it. But if you take one example of, say, I have one from 1936, and you turn its pages, you will find buildings which were what we now call Art Deco, you know, built in that year from Bombay, Pune, Ahmedabad, Surat, Morbi, Udaipur, Indore, Hyderabad, Secunderabad, Tuticorin, Bangalore, Lahore, Patna, Calcutta, Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Assam, New Delhi, Kanpur, Aligarh, Karachi, Madras, Coimbatore, Aleppi, amongst others. Okay, in 1936, just 1 year, you can see how prolific Art Deco was, and you can give credit entirely to the cement companies for doing that. And you don't have now architecture only for the elite, influential, or the rich, but it comes down in scale so that any new building, no matter what scale, can potentially be built in RCC. And this is how the virtues of concrete were advertised by the Cement Marketing Company of India. You know, they have these bylines, as you can see in the ad over there. They would say things like, concrete gives the maximum service for minimum expenditure. You know, excellent byline for people at large. Curved or square, it's equally easy for concrete, right? Putting you clearly, you know, at a different location from, say, a load-bearing construction, which you would earlier have built in stone or brick, you know, with timber roofs and so on. Saying it's all the same material, you can do whatever you like with it. Okay, so when these buildings came, they looked like this. This is an image of the Oval Maidan buildings, probably taken more or less within a year or so of their being built. These buildings, interestingly, came up in just 3 years in the late 1930s. The whole lot of them. Okay, these were the new plotted developments, and the buildings all started being built at the same time. These were also very interesting because they are self-similar. Each building is different, but there is still a harmony of development. There were certain bylaws which they followed, which were completely, consistent. They react to the tropics with these deep shades, these deep balconies, and all that. Because the one thing you need to do in our kind of climate is to protect your walls. Okay, we always have this idea that our buildings leak in Bombay, and that is because the walls are unprotected, not the roof. Okay, because we have tall buildings, right? We have more walls than roofs. So if you protect your walls, which these buildings did, you had some very fine buildings to live in. So this is just a kind of keyword grid that I have made, which we can talk about different words which relate to Art Deco. Some of this kind of comes out of my doctoral research, but this is interesting because when you look at these words, including the words which are slightly large and small, you get an idea of what the buildings in Art Deco were dominated by. They were dominated by form and color. They were geometric. They had rounded corners. There was a mass of architecture. They were modern in conceptualization. Let's look a little bit now about the elements that make up an Art Deco building. Okay, some of the best examples which we see in Bombay are cinema theaters like the Eros, apartment buildings like the intensely decorated Rajab Mahal, or the Lakshmi Insurance Building on Firozshah Mehta Road, which has its own kind of interesting iconography all over its surface. Okay, so how do you define Art Deco? Is there a definition at all possible? I think we have to look at them more in the context of self-similarity. There is no, there was no canon for Art Deco, unlike, say, earlier classical styles. You ask the question, did they all come up independently? They did. So how do they come up then? They come up through iteration. They come up through repetitive acts. They come up through looking at each other and developing things. So it's a much more organic way in which Art Deco develops. Now, to the best of my knowledge, when it comes to Bombay, Art Deco comes full-blown. I do not see a trajectory leading to Art Deco. I see the reverse, that Art Deco dies slowly, okay, right until the mid-50s. But when it comes with these oval Maidan buildings, everything is in place already. Okay, and this is what it looks like. This is Palm Court, drawing which was made by students of our college, JJ College of Architecture, and in fact there is a portfolio of facades which you will see today when you go to the exhibition, which are all on display, all the drawings. These facades, just these drawings, they tell us some very interesting things about the buildings of that time. There is always, first the flat roof, okay, to me, the number one feature of Art Deco buildings. Then they are always organized with this central feature which rises above, and then it divides itself into these kind of wings. And this central feature inevitably has a very systematic kind of rise. You have the entrance, then you have a canopy, then you have the typography which tells you the name of the building, then it identifies the position of the stairwell, and then it rises above the building, like a stepped kind of profile. Art Deco historians have called it a ziggurat kind of profile, which is like a stepped pyramid kind of thing. And we can talk a little bit about that. I believe the step profile actually comes from this, the bylaws of skyscraper building in Manhattan, which said that, you should, when you build a tall building, you cannot build it in a way that light will not fall on the ground. And therefore, you create these angles which say that you cannot build beyond that angle so that light is allowed to fall on the ground, and that is how you get this very typical step profile. Okay, you showed this building in South Africa, which had this very typical step profile. I believe it is the vestige of that step profile which we see in, say, a building like this, which is a kind of, again, it's not Manhattan, obviously, but it aspires to that kind of architecture seen in a smaller scale over here. So these features are only possible because of RCC, because of the way they are built. The other thing which we tend to see also is that there is a clear nod towards our tropical location and the fact that we are a port city, because there are a lot of nautical elements seen on Art Deco buildings in the form that they are done. One is this part which goes above into what we can call a crow's nest, or a kind of control which you find on ocean liners. Okay, you will see in other buildings circular porthole kind of windows. You will inevitably see these railings on the balconies which are like deck railings. And there are many such ideas which come from ocean liners. Now, ocean liners are signifiers of two things. One is mobility and speed, which becomes a very important thing to talk about when we look at Art Deco buildings. It's very interesting because a rigid building, tries to promote speed on its ornament. And of course, affluence or world, transcontinental mobility, which is what an ocean liner does. So that becomes a metaphor for life and living, which is cosmopolitan and international at the same time. So you find two types of ornament on Art Deco buildings. One is this. So I've kind of given a name to it. These are called enhancers. What enhancers do are they enhance the building as it is. So if the building has a certain horizontality, then you will have decoration that enhances the horizontality, which you can see with these lines which come there. The central part is vertical. You have elements that enhance its verticality. These are ornaments that follow the building itself, making it even more of what it is. More horizontal, more vertical, more curved, and so on. So these are enhancers. And then you have some more kinds of enhancers, which are mostly geometric pattern making. This kind of chevron shape is also another form of enhancer. But then you have another form of ornament, which is not just about developing the shape of the building, but is figural. Okay, they give the building more nuance. So I call these nuancers. Nuancers on these buildings are figural ornaments. Like on this very famous United Insurance building, you have these Amazon ladies, okay, which are the metaphor for, solidity, which are the metaphor even for, say, kind of protection. The interesting thing about the insurance buildings in Bombay is they are the ones with the maximum amount of symbolism on their facades, because they want to get the message across. Insure with us. We are the safe people. We will protect your, your money. You will have funds at the end when your insurance either comes through, should you need it. So what are the ways in which that can be presented? And we tend to see that this is at the base of this very same building. You tend to see other images, nuancers, which talk about life in India that is a slightly idealized kind of form, whether it is the craft, and you can see the potter at work, or whether it is, the farmer doing their, their hard work on the fields. All these get tied up into ideas of insurance, of, stability, of people who have come out of relatively poor backgrounds, now leading to a slightly better life. You also see other kinds of nuances, like in the first image, images of the sea, okay, of waves and surf, or in the second image, which also comes from the Lakshmi building, that of a herd of elephants walking through a forest. And to me, this actually kind of reminds me of the murals at Ajanta. You know, probably there is some sort of connect over there. I talked about how Art Deco had a long kind of decline, and this is what we see. You find that right from the 40s right until the mid 50s, Art Deco continues to be built, but with lesser and lesser features, lesser and lesser things. The first thing which vanishes is ornament. Okay, so here is another point to be made, that you can recognize an Art Deco building even if it has no ornament on it. So let us don't use the word deco as being anything more than just a label. Yeah, Art Deco doesn't mean that it's an ornamented building. Art Deco is very typically a building of its time. It is a building of the 30s and 40s mainly. So as you see Art Deco slowly changing, you will find, like say in the last two examples, the sea green on Marine Drive, there is nothing. It looks like a completely modern building. But it still has certain Art Deco features like the central part which is rising above. Okay, and its two wings. It has a flat roof. It has cantilevered projections, and an office building on Firoz Shah Mehta Road, which is without almost any kind of ornamentation at all. A cantilever is something which comes out like this without support. This is a cantilever. Yeah, there's no support to it. It comes out from the building directly, and we see that in the form of balconies, and we see that in the form of what we call chhajjas, canopies to protect the walls and the balconies. So I'll just end with this important thing, that we've talked about a lot of the background for how Art Deco emerges in Bombay and what it's called. But one of the most significant things that happened in the past, in 2018, was the UNESCO nomination. And we have to mention that most importantly. Art Deco is now a name embedded in the minds of the citizens of Bombay, and it has been normalized by various authors and academics, and most importantly by the UNESCO World Heritage nomination. This is what the nomination said, that Mumbai's Victorian and Art Deco developments, with their moorings in Western styles and indigenized through a collaboration of European and Indian architects, engineers and craftsmen, is an example of shared heritage at its best. Please remember that the special thing about these buildings is that they are now about 80 years old. However, in most cases, they have been constantly occupied, and they are occupied even today. And that, I think, makes it special. It's not that we are looking at ruins, yeah? But this also makes it incredibly fragile. And this is something we will see, I think, in the next 20 years or so. Whether Art Deco buildings will remain or whether they will be replaced because of real estate considerations. The next important stage, I believe, in heritage conservation will be the conservation of RCC. Okay, because we all look at RCC as a modern thing and we don't talk about it when it comes to heritage conservation. But we will have to look at that when when the turn of these buildings come. And I hope that that will be, that will lead to a good future. The most important thing about these buildings is they still define our public realm. If you close your eyes and you think of Bombay, inevitably, you're probably thinking of these buildings. And I think that is one very important reason why they should remain, they should be preserved and cherished, I believe. Yeah, thank you so much.
You spoke of a lack of decoration in buildings that are built towards the mid-century. Is there a reason for that? Maybe lack of craftsmanship or anything that you might be?
Well, yeah, maybe, but I don't think so. I think because buildings were built fast. The other thing is that there was also a mindset change, okay, amongst the architects and the artists at that time, which I said tended towards functionalism, saying that we can make a beautiful building without putting anything on it. You know, we can make a beautiful building just with its basic form and its method of construction.
What you say, which is interesting.
You said that Mr. Claude Batley wanted this nudist architecture and it was moving towards functionality, and I can see perhaps you mean, or he meant, moving from Indo-Saracenic to these forms. But in fact, this is really jewel-like architecture that invites the viewer to look and bask in it. And you confirm that when you say that there are no barriers between these buildings and the road. So it actually invites from the outside to look in. And paradoxically, as we also realize, when you're in one of those flats, they're rather dark. There's one or two the balconies that look out on the oval, but the rest of it is all rather, is attractive but mundane. There's nothing very distinctive from the inside. All the beauty is from the outside looking in. So for something to go...
I think that is something that I think needs to be, explored a little further. I have been looking at it more from the public realm perspective, but this would probably form a very genuine criticism. I do know for a fact that, and obviously, you kind of brush this under a carpet a little bit, that when these buildings first came out, they were roundly criticized. Okay, I think Claude Batley himself called it a set of ill-fitting teeth. Okay, and a lot of the people who lived in Bombay said that these are too tiny, these are too cramped, there's not enough light coming in. So these criticisms were there at that time, And I think they need to be taken up probably separately, and we can then have a better perspective on this. Sure.
Is there a special craft in the design of these buildings that has not been passed down over the ages? Do you think that could be one of the reasons why we don't see these in the newer buildings that have come up?
I think the special craft would be plaster work. Okay, because almost all the ornamentation on these buildings is stucco, is plaster work. So yes, I think that craft, losing that craft, would definitely be a loss. If people were not there to do that kind of thing, then you would simply make the buildings in RCC and just cover them up with some kind of plaster and the buildings would still be formed. Okay, but there is a steady loss of ornament, and if you look at buildings which come after the so-called Art Deco style, they are the ones without ornament at all. Okay, because they focus entirely on the form and shape of the building. The buildings from the 50s right until the 80s.
You said that this style is not dying, sorry, but in the smaller cities, in India, we find the same style repeated in public building or
in a small difference. The style is dying without doubt. What has become very prevalent in smaller buildings is that RCC now is the standard method of construction for all buildings everywhere. And that is why it looks so.
Yeah, but the style balcony,
But that's an inevitable form of RCC. But that doesn't mean they are Art Deco. You see, the Art Deco has its very specific kind of spirit, shall we say, to use a very odd kind of term, that you can make out. You can make two RCC buildings. One is Art Deco, one is not Art Deco. You can clearly make out.
Whatever the principles you said in the education, that same is everywhere.
I hope they are. I hope so. See, I told you the shadow of Art Deco is very long. Even today you can build an Art Deco building. There's nothing to stop you. The point is you don't. And that is the point.